In the heart of Bavaria, where rolling hills stretch endlessly toward the horizon and ancient forests whisper secrets older than memory, there once stood a farmstead that would become synonymous with one of Germany's most chilling unsolved mysteries. The name Hinterkaifeck, meaning, behind Kaifeck, would echo through the corridors of criminal history, a name that still sends shivers down the spines of those who dare to speak it. It was March 1922, and the Great War's shadows still lingered over Europe like a persistent fog. Germany was struggling to rebuild itself, its people yearning for normalcy in a world forever changed. But in this remote corner of Bavaria, normalcy was about to be shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. The Hinterkaifeck farm sat approximately 70 kilometers north of Munich, nestled in the small community of Grobern, near Weidhofen. It was an isolated place, the kind where neighbors were few and far between, where the nearest dwelling was a considerable walk through fields and forest paths. This isolation, which the Gruber family had once cherished for its peace and privacy, would soon become their doom. Andreas Gruber, aged 63, was the patriarch of this ill-fated household. He was a man carved from the Bavarian countryside itself, sturdy, weathered, and stubborn as the oak trees that dotted his property. His calloused hands told the story of decades spent working the unforgiving soil, coaxing life from the earth through sheer determination and backbreaking labor. Andreas was known throughout the region as a shrewd farmer and a man of few words, but those words carried weight when he chose to speak them. His wife, Kazilia, was 7 years his junior at 56, but the hardships of rural life had etched their mark upon her face just as deeply. She was a woman of quiet strength, the kind who could birth calves at dawn, prepare meals for a dozen farmhands by noon, and still have energy to mend clothes by candlelight. Kazilia managed the household with an iron will wrapped in maternal warmth, ensuring that despite their modest means, the Gruber farm remained a place of order and purpose. Their daughter Victoria Gabriel, aged 35, carried within her the complications that small communities love to whisper about. She was a widow, having lost her husband Karl Gabriel during the war, though the circumstances of his death remained shrouded in local gossip and speculation. Some said he had died honorably in the trenches of France, others whispered darker tales of desertion and mysterious disappearances. Victoria herself rarely spoke of her late husband, preferring to focus on raising her children and helping her parents maintain the farm. Young Kazilia, just 7 years old and named after her grandmother, was the light of the household. With her bright eyes and quick smile, she brought joy to the often somber atmosphere of rural life. The child was curious about everything, constantly asking questions that would make the adults pause and consider the world through fresh eyes. She attended the local school when weather permitted, walking the lonely path through the fields with the fearless confidence that only children possess. The youngest member of the family was 2-year-old Joseph, Victoria's son, a toddler whose laughter could be heard echoing across the farmyard on peaceful afternoons. He was at that age where every day brought new discoveries, where a butterfly or a puddle could provide hours of entertainment. Joseph represented hope for the future, a new generation that might see better times than those his family had endured. Completing the household was Maria Baumgartner, the family's maid, who had arrived at Hinterkaifeck just days before the tragedy would unfold. At 44 years old, Maria was a woman who had spent her life in service to others, moving from household to household as circumstances required. She was a stranger to the Gruber family dynamics, unaware of the tensions and secrets that simmered beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary rural existence. The winter of 1921 to 1922 had been particularly harsh, with snow blanketing the Bavarian countryside in a silence so complete it seemed to muffle even thoughts. As March arrived, the first tentative signs of spring began to appear, but with them came something else, something that made Andreas Gruber increasingly uneasy. It began with small things, the kind of incidents that might be easily dismissed by a less observant man. But Andreas was a farmer, attuned to the rhythms of his land, sensitive to any disturbance in the natural order of things. He began to notice footprints in the snow around his property, footprints that led from the forest edge toward the farm buildings, then seemed to vanish without explanation. At first, Andreas assumed they belonged to a lost traveler or perhaps a vagrant seeking shelter from the bitter cold. Such visits were not uncommon in rural areas, where wanderers often appeared at farmhouse doors begging for a meal or a warm place to spend the night. But these footprints were different. They appeared repeatedly, always following the same path, always stopping at specific points around the farm as if someone were conducting a systematic observation of the property. One evening, as Andreas sat by the fire attempting to lose himself in the pages of a farming almanac, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the distinct creak of floorboards above his head, coming from the attic. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth in the space above the family's bedrooms. "Did you hear that?" he whispered to Kazilia, who was mending one of Joseph's shirts by the flickering light of an oil lamp. She paused in her work, needle suspended in midair. "Hear what?" But even as she asked the question, the sound came again, creak, 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 unmistakably the sound of footsteps overhead. Andreas grabbed a lantern and the shotgun he kept beside the door, his heart pounding as he made his way to the attic ladder. But when he climbed up and swept the space with his lantern's pale glow, he found nothing but dust, cobwebs, and the accumulated memories of years past. The incidents continued to escalate. Andreas discovered that his spare house key, which he always kept hidden beneath a loose stone near the barn, had gone missing. Tools would disappear from their designated places, only to reappear days later in locations where Andreas was certain he had never left them. Most disturbing of all, the family began to hear voices, muffled conversations that seemed to emanate from somewhere within the walls of the farmhouse itself. Victoria, already fragile from the stresses of widowhood and single motherhood, became increasingly nervous. She would jump at shadows and insisted on checking the locks multiple times each night before retiring to bed. Young Kazilia complained of nightmares, claiming that she could hear someone walking in the attic above her room, calling her name in a voice she didn't recognize. The final straw came just days before the murders, when Andreas made a discovery that chilled him to his very core. While checking on the livestock one morning, he found a newspaper in the barn, a Munich publication dated just 2 days prior. The paper was folded neatly and placed on a hay bale where it could not have arrived by accident. Someone had been in his barn, reading comfortably as if they belonged there, close enough to his family to reach out and touch them while they slept. Andreas showed the newspaper to his neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, during one of their infrequent visits. Schlittenbauer, a man of practical disposition, suggested that perhaps Andreas should contact the local authorities. But Andreas, with the stubborn pride that characterized his generation of Bavarian farmers, refused. He would handle the situation himself, he declared. He would not be driven from his own land by shadows and whispers. It was a decision that would cost 6 people their lives. The events of those final days at Hinterkaifeck have been reconstructed from the testimonies of neighbors, the observations of investigators, and the haunting physical evidence left behind. What emerges is a picture of a family living in increasing terror, trapped by circumstances they could neither understand nor control. On Thursday, March 30, 1922, the previous maid, a woman who had worked for the Gruber family for several months, abruptly quit her position. Her reasons were never fully explained, but neighbors later recalled that she had seemed increasingly agitated in the weeks leading up to her departure. She spoke of strange noises, of feeling watched, of an atmosphere in the house that made her skin crawl. Some whispered that she had claimed the farmhouse was haunted, though such talk was dismissed by the more practical-minded residents of the area. This departure left the Gruber family in a difficult position. The work of maintaining a farm was too much for Andreas and Kazilia alone, particularly with Victoria caring for 2 young children. They needed help, and they needed it quickly. Through word of mouth and local connections, they managed to find Maria Baumgartner, a woman willing to take on the position despite the remote location and the rather hurried circumstances of her hiring. Maria arrived at Hinterkaifeck on Friday, March 31, 1922. What she found there, in those final hours, we can only imagine. Did she sense the same oppressive atmosphere that had driven her predecessor away? Did she notice the fearful glances between family members, the way they huddled together as darkness fell, the manner in which Andreas checked and rechecked the locks before bed? That Friday evening was the last time anyone from the outside world would see the inhabitants of Hinterkaifeck alive. A neighbor, walking past the farm on his way home from the village, later recalled seeing lights in the windows and smoke rising from the chimney, the familiar signs of a household settling in for the night. He remembered thinking how peaceful the scene looked, how perfectly normal everything appeared. Saturday, April 1, 1922, dawned gray and cold, with the kind of mist that clings to the ground like a burial shroud. It was on this day that evil finally revealed itself at Hinterkaifeck, though the world would not discover the horror for several more days. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came on Tuesday, April 4, 1922. Young Kazilia had failed to appear at school for several days, which was unusual for a child who rarely missed her lessons. The postman had also noticed that mail was accumulating in the Gruber family's box, remaining uncollected since Saturday. Most significantly, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Andreas's neighbor and a man who had business dealings with the family, became concerned when Andreas failed to appear for a previously arranged meeting. Schlittenbauer knew Andreas as a man of his word, someone who would never miss an appointment without sending word of his delay. Driven by growing unease, Schlittenbauer organized a small group of neighbors to check on the farm. The group included the local mechanic George Siegel, farmer Jacob Siegel, and several other residents who had grown worried about the unusual silence from Hinterkaifeck. As they approached the farmstead, the first thing they noticed was the eerie quiet. No sounds of livestock, no smoke from the chimney, no signs of the normal activity that characterized a working farm. The buildings seemed to crouch under the gray sky like wounded animals, and an inexplicable chill settled over the group as they drew nearer. They called out as they approached, their voices echoing strangely in the still air. Andreas. Kazilia. But only silence answered them, a silence so profound it seemed to have weight and substance. Schlittenbauer tried the main door of the farmhouse and found it unlocked, unusual for a family that had become increasingly security conscious in recent weeks. The group entered cautiously, calling out as they moved through the ground floor rooms. The house felt wrong somehow, as if the very air had been poisoned by unspeakable events. It was in the barn that they made the first gruesome discovery. There, lying in grotesque positions among the hay and farming implements, were 4 bodies. Andreas Gruber lay on his back, his skull crushed by what appeared to be multiple blows from a heavy instrument. Nearby was his wife Kazilia, her gray hair matted with dried blood, her peaceful face a stark contrast to the violence that had ended her life. Victoria Gabriel had been found closer to the barn entrance, as if she had been trying to flee when death overtook her. The positioning of her body suggested she had fought desperately for her life, her hands bearing defensive wounds that spoke of a struggle against an implacable enemy. Most heartbreaking of all was the discovery of 7-year-old Kazilia. The child lay crumpled like a broken doll, her school dress torn and blood-stained. The sight of her small form among the adult victims seemed to drain the color from the world itself, transforming the barn into a chamber of pure horror. But the nightmare was not yet complete. Returning to the farmhouse with trembling hands and hearts heavy with dread, the group made two more terrible discoveries. In one of the bedrooms, they found 2-year-old Joseph, lying in his small bed as if he had been sleeping when death came for him. Unlike the others, there were no signs of struggle around the toddler. He appeared to have been killed quietly, perhaps mercifully, in his sleep. The final victim was Maria Baumgartner, the maid who had arrived at Hinterkaifeck just days before the massacre. She was found in her own bedroom, positioned in a way that suggested she had been killed in her sleep, unaware of the horror that had already claimed the lives of the family she had come to serve. News of the Hinterkaifeck murder spread through Bavaria like wildfire, capturing the attention of both local authorities and the press. The sheer brutality of the crimes, combined with their seemingly motiveless nature, created a sensation that would endure for decades to come. The investigation was led by the Munich Police Department, considered among the most professional law enforcement agencies in Germany at that time. Detective Inspector George Reingruber took charge of the case, bringing with him a team of experienced investigators and the most modern forensic techniques available in 1922. From the beginning, the case presented numerous puzzling elements that defied easy explanation. The murder weapon appeared to be a mattock, a heavy farming tool similar to a pickaxe, but despite extensive searches, no such implement was ever found at the scene. This suggested that either the killer had brought his own weapon or had disposed of the murder weapon so thoroughly that it was never recovered. Even more baffling was the timeline of the murders. Based on the condition of the bodies and other physical evidence, investigators determined that the family had been killed sometime during the night of Saturday, April 1st, or in the early hours of Sunday, April 2nd. However, there were disturbing signs that someone had been living in the house for several days after the murders were committed. The kitchen showed evidence of recent meals having been prepared. Food had been consumed from the family's stores, and dishes had been washed and put away. Most chilling of all, the farm's animals had been fed and cared for, suggesting that the killer had remained on the property, calmly going about daily routines while surrounded by the bodies of his victims. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney on Sunday and Monday, indicating that someone had been maintaining fires in the fireplace. The postman noted that someone had been collecting the mail, as letters that should have accumulated in the mailbox had apparently been taken inside. This behavior was unprecedented in the annals of criminal history. What kind of person commits a brutal multiple murder and then remains at the scene for days, living among the corpses as if nothing had happened? The psychological implications were staggering, suggesting a killer of extraordinary coldness and calculation. The forensic investigation of Hinterkaifeck revealed details that made the case even more perplexing and horrifying. Each piece of evidence seemed to deepen the mystery rather than provide clarity, creating a puzzle that would confound investigators for generations. The autopsies, conducted by Dr. Johann Baptist Neumayer, revealed that all 6 victims had been killed by blows to the head with a heavy, blunt instrument. The wounds were consistent with those that would be caused by a mattock or similar farming tool. However, the pattern of injuries varied significantly between victims, suggesting different circumstances for each death. Andreas and Cecilia Gruber had suffered multiple severe blows, indicating that they had likely been the first to encounter the killer and had possibly attempted to defend themselves or flee. The defensive wounds on their hands and arms told a story of desperate struggle against an overwhelming force. Victoria Gabriel's injuries were similarly severe, with evidence suggesting she had been struck down while trying to run toward the barn door. Her position when found indicated that she had almost reached potential safety when the killer caught up with her. Young Cecilia presented a particularly heartbreaking case. The child had sustained fewer but equally fatal head injuries, and the evidence suggested she had been killed quickly, perhaps to prevent her from crying out and alerting others. The deliberate nature of her murder spoke to a killer who was coldly methodical in his approach. 2-year-old Joseph showed signs of having been killed in his sleep, with a single devastating blow that would have caused instant death. The lack of defensive wounds or signs of struggle suggested that he never woke up, a small mercy in the midst of unspeakable horror. Maria Baumgartner's case was equally tragic. The maid, who had been at Hinterkaifeck for less than a week, appeared to have been killed in her bed, possibly after being awakened by the sounds of violence elsewhere in the house. The positioning of her body suggested she had attempted to sit up when the killer entered her room. One of the most disturbing discoveries was the evidence of post-mortem activity at the farm. Investigators found clear signs that someone had been living in the house for several days after the murders. The killer had apparently made himself at home, eating the family's food, sleeping in their beds, and maintaining the daily routines of farm life. The kitchen contained evidence of multiple meals having been prepared and consumed. Dirty dishes had been washed and put away with meticulous care. The animals had been fed and watered regularly, and someone had even milked the cows and collected eggs from the chickens. This suggested a person who was not only comfortable with farm work but who possessed the psychological fortitude to carry out mundane tasks while surrounded by the decomposing bodies of his victims. As the investigation progressed, several potential suspects emerged, each with their own motives and opportunities. The isolated nature of the farm and the apparent familiarity the killer showed with the property suggested someone who knew the family and their routines. The first and most obvious suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had discovered the bodies. Schlittenbauer had been involved in a complicated relationship with Victoria Gabriel, and there were persistent rumors that he was the father of young Joseph. This would have created a scandalous situation in the conservative Bavarian community of 1922, providing a potential motive for murder. Schlittenbauer's behavior during and after the discovery of the bodies also raised suspicions. He had been the first to enter the farmhouse and had spent considerable time alone inside before alerting the other neighbors to what he had found. Critics of the investigation later pointed out that this would have given him ample opportunity to remove or plant evidence. Furthermore, Schlittenbauer was familiar with the farm's layout and daily routines. He would have known where the family slept, when they typically went to bed, and how to move about the property without alerting the neighbors. His agricultural background would have made him comfortable with tools like the mattock believed to be the murder weapon. However, Schlittenbauer also had an alibi for the critical time period. Multiple witnesses placed him at various locations throughout the weekend of the murders, and his own family confirmed his presence at home during the nights in question. While alibis could be fabricated, the sheer number of people who would have had to conspire to protect him made this scenario increasingly unlikely. Another significant suspect was Karl Gabriel, Victoria's supposedly deceased husband. Gabriel had disappeared during the war under mysterious circumstances, and his body had never been found or officially confirmed dead. Some investigators theorized that he might have survived and returned to discover his wife living with her parents and children, including young Joseph, whose paternity was questionable. This theory suggested that Gabriel might have been hiding in the area for some time, accounting for the strange incidents that had been troubling the Gruber family in the weeks leading up to the murders. The footprints in the snow, the missing key, the sounds in the attic, all could be explained by a man secretly observing his former home and planning his revenge. The fact that someone had been living at the farm for days after the murders also supported this theory. Gabriel would have been familiar with the property and comfortable carrying out farm chores. His military experience during the war might have given him the psychological hardness necessary to remain calm among the bodies of his victims. However, extensive investigations into Gabriel's wartime service and disappearance failed to produce any concrete evidence that he had survived. Military records, while incomplete due to the chaos of war, seemed to support the conclusion that he had indeed died in combat. Moreover, no reliable sightings of Gabriel in the area were ever confirmed, despite intensive searching. A third category of suspects included various drifters, deserters, and displaced persons who might have been wandering the Bavarian countryside in the aftermath of the war. Germany in 1922 was still struggling with the social and economic disruption caused by the conflict, and many people had been displaced from their homes and traditional livelihoods. Such individuals might have targeted the isolated farm for robbery, only to have the situation escalate to murder when they encountered the family. The post-murder behavior of remaining at the scene could be explained by the killer's need for shelter and food, combined with a calculation that the remote location would provide time to plan an escape. However, this theory failed to account for several key pieces of evidence. The murders showed a level of planning and familiarity with the victim's routines that suggested more than a random crime of opportunity. Moreover, nothing of significant value appeared to have been stolen from the farmhouse, arguing against robbery as a primary motive. As the investigation dragged on without resolution, more exotic theories began to emerge. The strange incidents that had preceded the murders, combined with the inexplicable behavior of the killer, led some to suggest supernatural explanations for the tragedy at Hinterkaifeck. Local folklore was rich with tales of spirits and supernatural entities that inhabited the forests and remote areas of Bavaria. Some residents whispered that the farm had been built on cursed ground, or that the Gruber family had somehow angered the spirits that dwelt in the ancient woods surrounding their property. The sounds in the attic, the mysterious footprints, and the sensation of being watched that had plagued the family were all consistent with traditional ghost stories and supernatural encounters. Some theorists suggested that these phenomena had driven a member of the family to madness, resulting in a murder-suicide that investigators had misinterpreted as an outside attack. However, the forensic evidence clearly contradicted this theory. The pattern of injuries and the physical evidence at the scene were inconsistent with any scenario involving family members attacking each other. Moreover, the post-murder behavior of feeding animals and maintaining the farm required a level of rational planning that argued against a perpetrator in the grip of supernatural madness. Despite the initial intensity of the investigation, the case gradually began to lose momentum as months passed without any breakthrough discoveries. The lack of physical evidence, reliable witnesses, or clear motives made it increasingly difficult to pursue any particular line of inquiry with confidence. Public interest in the case remained high, but this actually became counterproductive as amateur investigators and sensation seekers began to interfere with official efforts. The crime scene was contaminated by curious visitors, potential evidence was disturbed or removed, and false leads multiplied as people came forward with dubious claims and theories. The political and social upheaval of early 1920s Germany also diverted attention and resources away from the investigation. The country was grappling with economic crisis, political extremism, and social unrest that made the solution of a rural murder case seem less pressing than it might have in more stable times. Furthermore, the investigative techniques available in 1922, while advanced for their era, were primitive compared to modern forensic methods. There was no DNA analysis, no computer databases for tracking suspects, and no sophisticated psychological profiling. Investigators had to rely primarily on physical evidence, witness testimony, and traditional detective work, all of which had proved insufficient in this case. The Hinterkaifeck murders have never been officially solved, but they have continued to fascinate investigators, historians, and amateur sleuths throughout the decades. In 2007, nearly 85 years after the original crimes, a team of forensic students from the Bavarian Police Academy decided to re-examine the case using modern investigative techniques. This new investigation involved creating detailed computer models of the crime scene, analyzing previously overlooked pieces of evidence with advanced forensic methods, and applying modern psychological profiling techniques to develop a more sophisticated understanding of the killer's personality and motivations. The students concluded that the most likely scenario involved a single perpetrator who was familiar with the farm and the family's routines. They theorized that the killer was probably a local resident with agricultural experience, possibly someone who had worked on the farm or had business dealings with Andreas Gruber. The psychological profile suggested a methodical, patient individual with a strong capacity for planning and self-control. The killer's ability to remain at the scene for several days after the murders indicated an unusual level of psychological resilience and possibly a form of mental disorder that allowed him to compartmentalize his emotions and continue functioning normally despite having committed horrific crimes. However, even these modern techniques could not definitively identify the perpetrator. The passage of time had destroyed much potential evidence, and all the original suspects and witnesses had long since died. The case remained as mysterious as ever, a testament to both the limitations of criminal investigation and the enduring power of unsolved mysteries to capture the human imagination. Over the decades since the murders, numerous theories have been proposed to explain the Hinterkaifeck tragedy. Some focus on the personal relationships and family dynamics that might have motivated the killings, while others suggest broader social or political factors that could have played a role. One persistent theory involves the complicated paternity of young Joseph. If Lorenz Schlittenbauer was indeed the child's father, this would have created a scandal that could have had serious social and financial consequences for all involved. In the conservative Catholic culture of rural Bavaria, illegitimate children were often treated as pariahs, and their fathers could face significant social ostracism and economic hardship. Some theorists suggest that Andreas Gruber might have been blackmailing Schlittenbauer or threatening to expose the truth about Joseph's parentage. This could have provided a powerful motive for murder, particularly if Schlittenbauer felt that his reputation, marriage, or livelihood were at stake. Another theory focuses on potential financial motives. The Gruber farm, while not wealthy, represented significant value in terms of land, livestock, and equipment. If Andreas had been involved in business disputes or had debts that he was unable to pay, this might have led to conflicts that escalated to violence. Some investigators have also considered the possibility of political motives. The early 1920s were a time of intense political upheaval in Germany, with various extremist groups competing for influence and control. Rural areas were often hotbeds of political activity, and it's possible that the Gruber family had become involved in or had been targeted by one of these groups. However, none of these theories has ever been supported by conclusive evidence. The case remains a puzzle with too many missing pieces, a story with crucial chapters that have been lost to time. The Hinterkaifeck farm was demolished in 1923, less than a year after the murders. The local community, traumatized by the horrific events and unable to find anyone willing to live on the property, decided that the buildings themselves had become too closely associated with evil to ever serve their original purpose again. Today, the site is marked only by a small memorial and some foundation stones half hidden by grass and wildflowers. Visitors who make the pilgrimage to this remote spot often report feeling an inexplicable chill, a sense of sadness and unease that seems to emanate from the very ground itself. The Hinterkaifeck murders have become part of German folklore, referenced in books, documentaries, and academic studies of unsolved crimes. They represent something more than just another criminal case. They embody the fear that evil can strike anywhere, at any time, without warning or apparent reason. The case also serves as a reminder of the limitations of human knowledge and justice. Despite all our advances in technology and forensic science, there are still mysteries that resist solution, crimes that remain unpunished, and questions that may never be answered. In an age where we often believe that every problem has a solution and every question has an answer, Hinterkaifeck stands as a humbling reminder that some secrets are buried too deeply to ever be fully uncovered. Perhaps that is the true horror of Hinterkaifeck, not just the brutal murders themselves, but the knowledge that somewhere, in the shadows of history, the truth remains hidden. The killer's identity, his motives, and the exact sequence of events that led to 6 innocent deaths remain locked away in the past, beyond the reach of justice or understanding. As long as the mystery endures, the victims of Hinterkaifeck will never truly rest in peace. Their story continues to echo through the generations, a ghost story made all the more frightening by the fact that it is entirely real. In the end, perhaps that is the most fitting memorial to Andreas, Casilia, Victoria, little Casilia, Joseph, and Maria, that their tragedy serves as a reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of unanswered questions to haunt the human imagination. The wind still blows across the fields where Hinterkaifeck once stood, carrying with it whispers of the past and echoes of a mystery that time itself has been unable to solve. And in that eternal silence, 6 voices continue to call out from beyond the grave, seeking the justice and peace that have eluded them for more than a century.